In the mountains of Afghanistan, where the air is thin and bullets fly thicker than snowflakes, there's an unspoken rule among elite soldiers: never underestimate the quiet ones. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos learned this the hard way when she proved that being just a medic meant absolutely nothing when lives hung in the balance. What happened on that blood-soaked ridge would forever change how Navy SEALs viewed the woman they once dismissed as another support soldier. The story you're about to read isn't about superhuman strength or Hollywood heroics. It's about a 28-year-old Army medic from Texas who carried 4 wounded warriors across 5,000 meters of hostile terrain while under enemy fire, using nothing but her medical training, stubborn determination, and a heart that refused to let her brothers in arms die on her watch. This is the story of how Maria Santos went from being overlooked to becoming a legend whispered about in military circles worldwide. By the time the rescue helicopters arrived, the SEALs who had questioned her presence on their mission were ready to follow her into hell itself. This is that story. Maria Santos never planned on becoming a hero. She grew up in a small town outside Houston where the biggest emergency was usually Mrs. Garcia's cat stuck in a tree or someone getting stung by a bee at the annual church picnic. Her mother worked double shifts at the local diner, and her father fixed cars in their garage that always smelled like motor oil and dreams deferred. Money was tight, college seemed impossible, and the military recruiter who visited her high school painted pictures of adventure and purpose that her 18-year-old heart couldn't resist. The Army promised her medical training, and Maria jumped at the chance. She had always been good with her hands, patient with people, and calm under pressure. These traits served her well during basic training at Fort Sam Houston, where she excelled in combat medical courses while her male counterparts struggled with the detailed memorization required for field medicine. Her instructors noticed her natural ability to remain focused during chaotic training scenarios, but Maria didn't think much of it. She was just doing her job. After completing advanced medical training, Maria was assigned to the 68th Medical Company at Fort Bragg. The transition from the structured environment of training to the real world of military medicine was jarring. Her unit was responsible for providing medical support to various special operations units, which meant Maria found herself working with some of the most elite soldiers in the American military. These weren't the regular Army guys she trained with. These were Rangers, Green Berets, and occasionally Navy SEALs. The SEALs were different. They moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, spoke in clipped, efficient sentences, and had a way of looking through support personnel as if they were furniture. Maria understood the hierarchy. She was support staff, they were operators. She carried medical supplies and trauma kits. They carried the mission. It was a clear division that everyone seemed comfortable with except Maria, who couldn't shake the feeling that she was capable of more than just patching wounds in the safety of a forward operating base. Her first deployment to Afghanistan came 18 months after she arrived at Bragg. The FOB was located in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, a region known for its beautiful scenery and deadly Taliban presence. The base itself was a collection of concrete barriers, makeshift buildings, and enough weapons to level a small city. Maria's medical station was positioned near the landing zone, a strategic location that allowed for quick treatment of incoming wounded and rapid evacuation if necessary. The SEALs arrived 3 weeks into her deployment. Team 7 was led by Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison, a 15-year veteran whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Morrison was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of intense stare that made grown men reconsider their life choices. His team consisted of 5 other SEALs, each one a specialist in their particular brand of controlled violence. They were in country for a series of high-value target operations that required surgical precision and absolute reliability. Maria's first interaction with Team 7 came when she was restocking medical supplies in the team room. She had knocked on the door, received a grunt that she interpreted as permission to enter, and walked into a room where 6 of America's deadliest warriors were studying satellite photos of their next target. The conversation stopped when she entered. Morrison looked up from the photos with mild annoyance. "You need something, Doc?" The nickname stung, though she didn't let it show. She wasn't a doctor, and everyone in the room knew it. She was a medic, and in the special operations community, that distinction mattered. Doctors stayed in hospitals. Medics went where the shooting was. "Just checking on your medical supplies, sir," Maria replied, keeping her voice steady. "Making sure you have everything you need for your next operation." "We're good," Morrison replied, already turning back to his photos. "Johnson handles our medical gear." Johnson, the team's designated corpsman, barely looked up from cleaning his rifle. He was Navy medical, technically outranking Maria despite being the same age. "Yeah, we're set. Thanks, though." Maria nodded and left, but the dismissal bothered her more than it should have. She had trained for over 2 years to support exactly these kinds of operations. She had studied battlefield trauma, practiced emergency procedures until she could perform them blindfolded, and scored higher on her medical exams than anyone in her class. Yet here she was, relegated to restocking supplies while the real medics went on the real missions. 3 days later, everything changed. Team 7 was preparing for an operation to capture a high-value Taliban commander hiding in a compound 20 kilometers from base. The intelligence suggested minimal resistance, a quick in-out operation that should have the team back in time for dinner. Johnson, their corpsman, had been complaining about stomach issues for the past day, and during final preparations, he collapsed in the ready room. Maria was called in to examine him. One look was enough to diagnose acute appendicitis. Johnson needed immediate evacuation to a surgical facility, which meant Team 7 was down their medic for what should have been a routine operation. Mission parameters allowed them to proceed without medical support for low-risk operations, but Morrison seemed uncomfortable with the idea. "We could push the operation," suggested Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, Morrison's second-in-command. "Wait for Johnson to recover or get a replacement." Morrison studied the mission timeline. Intel suggested the target would only be at the location for another 48 hours. Waiting meant losing their best chance to capture him. Negative, he decided. "We go tonight." Maria stepped forward before she could second-guess herself. "Sir, I could fill in for Johnson." The room went quiet. 6 SEALs turned to stare at the Army medic who had just volunteered for a special operations mission. Morrison's expression was unreadable. "You ever been off base?" asked Petty Officer Williams, the team's sniper. "No, sir, but I'm qualified for combat operations. I've trained for exactly this kind of mission." Morrison seemed to consider this for a long moment. Maria could see him weighing options, calculating risks. The mission was classified as low risk, but that was never a guarantee in Afghanistan. On the other hand, having medical support was always preferable to going without, even if that support came from an untested Army medic. "What's your trauma experience?" Morrison asked. Maria straightened. "I've treated gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns, and compound fractures. I'm qualified on all standard medical equipment and can perform emergency surgery if necessary. My response time for trauma assessment is under 30 seconds, and I've never lost a patient during stabilization." It was an impressive resume, but Morrison still seemed skeptical. "This isn't a training exercise, Santos. If shooting starts, You might be the difference between my guys making it home or not. I understand that, sir. I wouldn't volunteer if I didn't think I could handle it. Rodriguez leaned over to Morrison and whispered something Maria couldn't hear. Morrison nodded, then looked back at her. You'll carry your own weight. No special consideration because you're support staff. We move fast, we stay quiet, and if things go sideways, you keep up or you get left behind. I understand, sir. And if any of my boys get hurt because you couldn't handle the pressure, we're going to have problems. Maria met his stare without flinching. That won't happen, sir. Morrison studied her for another moment, then nodded. Gear up. We leave in 2 hours. As Maria left to prepare her equipment, she could hear the team discussing her addition to the mission. The words weren't entirely flattering, but she didn't care. She had finally gotten her chance to prove that she was more than just another support soldier. She just had a hope she could live up to her own confidence. Her medical kit was packed with enough supplies to handle multiple trauma cases. She checked each item twice, ensuring everything was in its proper place and easily accessible. Her personal weapon, an M4 carbine, was cleaned and loaded with 5 magazines of ammunition. She had trained with the rifle countless times, but never fired it in anger. Tonight, that might change. The helicopter ride to the insertion point was Maria's first time leaving the base. The landscape below was a moonlit maze of mountains and valleys that looked both beautiful and terrifying. The SEALs sat in professional silence, each man focused on his own pre-mission rituals. Maria tried to mirror their calm, but her heart was racing with a mixture of excitement and terror. Morrison's voice crackled through her headset as they approached the landing zone. Remember, Santos, stay close, stay quiet, and do your job. Everything else is background noise. Maria keyed her radio. Roger that, sir. The helicopter touched down in a clearing 3 kilometers from the target compound. The team moved off the aircraft with practiced efficiency, and Maria followed, trying to match their silent movement through the rocky terrain. The mountain air was thin and cold, making each breath visible in the darkness. Maria's medical pack felt heavier than it had during training, but she kept pace with the team as they moved toward their objective. The compound appeared ahead of them after an hour of careful movement. Intelligence had been accurate. It was a small collection of buildings surrounded by a low wall, with minimal security visible. Morrison signaled for the team to take positions, and Maria found herself crouched behind a boulder, watching as the SEALs prepared to breach the compound. Everything happened exactly as planned for the first 5 minutes. The team moved through the compound with precision, clearing rooms and securing the target without firing a shot. Maria followed behind the assault element, ready to provide medical support, but finding nothing to do except watch professionals at work. The target was secured in the main building, zip-tied, and ready for transport. Rodriguez was coordinating with the extraction helicopter when the first shot rang out from the mountains surrounding the compound. Then came the second shot, and the third, and suddenly the night erupted into a chaos of gunfire and shouting. Maria's world changed in that instant. The training exercises, the scenarios, the classroom discussions about combat medicine suddenly became terrifyingly real. She could hear bullets snapping through the air above her head and the distinctive crack of incoming sniper fire. Rodriguez was on the radio, calling for immediate extraction, while Morrison coordinated return fire. Sniper on the ridge. Williams called out, pointing toward a muzzle flash in the mountains. Multiple shooters. That's when Maria heard the sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come. It was Morrison's voice, but different. Strained. Scared. Man down. I need a medic. Petty Officer Johnson wasn't there. Johnson was back at base recovering from surgery. There was only Maria, crouched behind cover while bullets flew overhead, with 6 of America's elite warriors depending on her to do her job. She grabbed her medical kit and ran toward Morrison's voice, and her real story began. Maria's boots slipped on the loose rocks as she sprinted toward Morrison's position. The sound of gunfire was deafening, echoing off the mountain walls and making it impossible to determine exactly where the shots were coming from. Her medical training had taught her to stay low during movement under fire, but her heart was screaming at her to run faster, to reach the wounded man before it was too late. She found Morrison behind a low stone wall, clutching his left shoulder. Blood was seeping through his fingers, dark against his tactical gear. Petty Officer Williams lay beside him, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound that looked worse than it probably was. Maria's training kicked in automatically, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she assessed both casualties. "Where are you hit?" she asked Morrison, already reaching for her trauma kit. "Shoulder, maybe collarbone," Morrison replied through gritted teeth. Williams took shrapnel to the head when that last round hit the wall. Maria's hands found the wound in Morrison's shoulder. The bullet had passed through the muscle without hitting bone or major arteries, a painful but not life-threatening injury. Williams's head wound was bleeding heavily, as head wounds always did, but her quick examination revealed it was superficial. Both men would live, but they needed immediate treatment to prevent complications. "I need to stop the bleeding," Maria told Morrison, pulling pressure bandages from her kit. "This is going to hurt." Morrison managed a weak grin. "Everything hurts right now. Document." There was that nickname again, but this time it didn't sting. This time it felt like acceptance. Maria worked quickly, applying pressure bandages to Morrison's shoulder and checking Williams for signs of concussion. The gunfire around them was intensifying, and she could hear Rodriguez coordinating defensive positions while trying to maintain radio contact with their extraction helicopter. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. "How bad?" Rodriguez called out from his position near the compound wall. "Morrison's stable. Williams is unconscious, but breathing normally," Maria replied. "They both need evacuation, but they're not critical." That's when the sound of aircraft filled the air. For a moment, Maria thought their extraction helicopter had arrived early, but the sound was wrong. Too heavy, too aggressive. Rodriguez's voice confirmed her fears. "Apache gunship inbound. Taliban reinforcements." The helicopter appeared over the ridge line like an angry wasp, its spotlight cutting through the darkness as it searched for targets. Maria realized with growing horror that the Taliban had air support, which meant this wasn't the simple ambush it had appeared to be. This was a coordinated attack, and Team 7 had walked into a trap. The Apache's machine gun opened fire, raking the compound with devastating accuracy. Concrete exploded around them as heavy-caliber rounds tore through the walls that had been providing cover. Maria threw herself over Williams, shielding him from the falling debris while Morrison rolled deeper behind their stone wall. "We need to move," Morrison shouted over the roar of the helicopter. "This position is compromised." Rodriguez was already organizing a fighting withdrawal. The team would move in pairs, providing covering fire for each other as they fell back to a more defensible position. It was standard infantry tactics, but Maria had never experienced anything like it outside of training exercises. "Santos," Rodriguez called out. "Can Morrison move?" Maria checked Morrison's bandages. The pressure dressing was holding, but movement would increase bleeding and risk shock. Williams was stirring, which was a good sign, but he would be unsteady on his feet for several minutes. Morrison can move with assistance, she replied. Williams needs another minute. We don't have another minute. The Apache was making another pass, and Maria could see the pilot lining up for another strafing run. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the helicopter's guns would tear their position apart. Maria made a decision that would define the rest of the night. Instead of waiting for Williams to recover, she grabbed him under the arms and started dragging him toward the rally point Rodriguez had designated. Williams was bigger than her by at least 60 pounds, and his dead weight made movement difficult, but Maria's adrenaline-fueled strength proved sufficient. Morrison followed, using his good arm to provide covering fire while Rodriguez and the other SEALs laid down suppressing fire against the sniper positions in the mountains. The withdrawal was controlled chaos, a deadly dance between providing enough firepower to keep the enemy's heads down while moving fast enough to avoid being pinned in place. They reached the rally point just as the Apache completed its second strafing run. The new position was a cluster of large boulders that provided better cover from aerial attack, but Maria could see that it was only a temporary solution. The Taliban forces were moving to surround them, and without immediate extraction, Team 7 would be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Williams had regained consciousness during the movement, and was now able to move under his own power, though Maria could see he was still disoriented. Morrison's wound was bleeding again despite the pressure bandage, and she knew she needed to get him proper medical treatment soon or risk permanent damage to his shoulder. What's our extraction status? Morrison asked Rodriguez. Rodriguez's expression was grim. Helicopter took fire on approach. They're pulling back to assess damage. Earliest pickup is 30 minutes. 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours. Maria could hear voices in the distance, Taliban fighters moving through the compound and spreading out to search the surrounding area. The enemy knew exactly where Team 7 was located, and they had the numbers and equipment to make a prolonged fight very one-sided. We can't hold this position, stated Petty Officer Garcia, the team's communications specialist. Too much open ground, no escape routes. Morrison was studying the terrain around them, his tactical mind working despite his injury. There's a ridgeline about 5,000 meters north of here. Higher ground, better fields of fire. If we can reach it, we can hold until extraction. 5,000 meters? Rodriguez looked skeptical. That's a lot of ground to cover with wounded. Maria realized they were talking about her patients. Morrison and Williams were mobile, but they would slow down the team significantly during movement across difficult terrain. In a tactical situation, the mathematics were brutal. 6 healthy SEALs might make it to safety. 2 wounded men would endanger everyone. I can keep them moving, Maria said quietly. Morrison looked at her with surprise. Santos, that's not your call to make. Yes, sir, it is. You're my patients, and my job is to get you home alive. If that means carrying you 5,000 meters, then that's what happens. The confidence in her voice surprised even Maria. She had never carried wounded men across hostile terrain under enemy fire. She had never been shot at by professional soldiers or hunted by attack helicopters. But something inside her had awakened during the chaos of the last 30 minutes. Something that told her she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. Rodriguez was monitoring radio traffic, trying to coordinate with higher headquarters while tracking enemy movement. Decision time, he announced. Taliban forces are moving to cut off our northern route. If we're going to move, it has to be now. Morrison struggled to his feet, testing his wounded shoulder. I can make it. Williams was steadier now, though Maria could see he was still fighting the effects of his concussion. I'm good to go. Maria quickly checked both men's bandages and vital signs. Morrison's pulse was elevated but strong. Williams's pupils were equal and reactive. Both men were functional, but she would need to monitor them carefully during movement. Standard movement formation, Rodriguez ordered. Garcia on point, Williams, and Morrison in the middle with Santos. Morrison, you're our eyes on the back trail. Everyone else provides security. They moved out into the darkness, leaving the temporary safety of the boulder field for the uncertainty of open mountain terrain. Maria found herself in the middle of a tactical formation, surrounded by some of the most elite soldiers in the world, responsible for keeping 2 wounded warriors alive during what promised to be the longest night of her life. The first kilometer was the hardest. Maria's legs weren't accustomed to the rapid pace the SEALs maintained even when moving tactically. Her medical pack, which had felt manageable during training, now seemed to weigh 100 pounds. Her patients were struggling too, Morrison's wound bleeding more freely with each step, Williams occasionally stumbling as his concussion affected his balance. But Maria discovered something about herself during that first hour of movement. She was stronger than she had believed, more determined than she had imagined, and completely unwilling to accept failure when lives depended on her. When Morrison faltered, she was there to steady him. When Williams needed a moment to rest, she provided security while monitoring his condition. When the pace threatened to overwhelm her, she found reserves of strength she didn't know existed. The Taliban pursuit was relentless. Maria could hear voices behind them, sometimes close enough to make out individual words. The enemy was tracking their movement, probably using night vision equipment to follow their trail across the rocky terrain. Every few minutes, distant gunfire would echo through the mountains as the pursuing forces engaged imaginary targets or simply tried to panic the fleeing Americans. 2 hours into their movement, Williams collapsed. Maria was beside him immediately, checking his pulse and breathing while the rest of the team established a defensive perimeter. His vital signs were stable, but the combination of his head injury and the grueling pace had finally overwhelmed his system. He needs rest, Maria told Rodriguez. How long? Maria looked at Williams, then at the distant lights of Taliban search parties moving through the valley behind them. 10 minutes minimum, but he really needs an hour. We don't have an hour. Morrison was examining their position on his tactical map. We've covered about half the distance. If Williams can't continue, we'll have to find another solution. Maria knew what another solution meant in military terminology. They would have to leave Williams behind, either hidden somewhere safe for later recovery or defended by part of the team while the others continued to the extraction point. Neither option was acceptable. I'll carry him, Maria said simply. Rodriguez stared at her. Santos, Williams weighs 200 pounds. You can't carry him 3 kilometers across mountain terrain. Maria looked at the unconscious SEAL, then at the men who were depending on her medical expertise to bring everyone home alive. Yes, I can. Maria had never attempted to carry a 200-pound man across 3 kilometers of mountain terrain. She had trained for casualty evacuation, practiced various carrying techniques, and studied the biomechanics of moving wounded soldiers, but theory and reality were proving to be very different things. Williams was unconscious dead weight, his body armor and equipment adding additional pounds that made every step a monumental effort. She started with a fireman's carry, draping Williams across her shoulders and distributing his weight as evenly as possible. The technique worked for the first few hundred meters, but the uneven terrain made it impossible to maintain balance. Rocks shifted under her feet, and she nearly fell twice before Rodriguez called for a halt. This isn't working, Rodriguez said, watching Maria struggle with Williams's limp form. You're going to hurt yourself, and that doesn't help anybody. Maria's legs were already trembling from the effort, but she refused to give up. Give me a minute to adjust. She switched to a drag technique, pulling Williams by his body armor while moving backwards. It was slower than carrying him, but it required less strength and allowed her to maintain better control. The disadvantage was that it left Williams more vulnerable to injury from rocks and debris, but Maria carefully chose their path to minimize damage to her patient. Morrison, despite his own wound, moved up to help. I can take his legs. You need to preserve your strength, Maria replied, continuing to drag Williams across a particularly rough patch of ground. I've got this. But the truth was that she didn't have it. Not really. The pace she could maintain while dragging Williams was painfully slow, and the sound of their pursuers was getting closer. Garcia, who was providing rear security, reported that the Taliban search parties had closed to within a kilometer of their position. We need to move faster, Rodriguez announced. Though he seemed reluctant to pressure Maria, they're gaining ground. Maria's mind raced through possible solutions. She could abandon Williams, but that wasn't an option. She could ask for more help from the team, but Morrison was wounded and the others needed to maintain security. She could try to find a better carrying technique, but her strength was already failing. That's when she remembered something from her emergency medical training. During disaster response scenarios, she had learned about adrenaline-enhanced strength, the phenomenon that allowed ordinary people to perform extraordinary physical feats during crisis situations. The key was not to fight the adrenaline, but to harness it, to use the body's natural stress response as a source of power rather than a distraction. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, focusing on her breathing and allowing the fear and desperation she had been suppressing to fuel her determination. When she opened them, William seemed lighter somehow, more manageable. She adjusted her grip on his body armor and resumed movement, this time maintaining a pace that kept up with the rest of the team. The technique worked for nearly an hour. Maria dragged Williams across rocky slopes, through dried creek beds, and over terrain that would have been challenging even without a wounded man in tow. Her hands were torn and bleeding from gripping Williams's equipment. Her back screamed with pain from the unnatural posture, and her lungs burned from the thin mountain air, but she kept moving. The Taliban forces were still pursuing, but their search pattern suggested they had lost the Americans' exact trail. Instead of following directly behind Team 7, the enemy fighters were spreading out across the valley, checking potential hiding spots and likely routes. It was buying the SEALs time, but not much. Morrison's condition was deteriorating. The constant movement had reopened his wound despite Maria's field dressing, and she could see signs of shock beginning to set in. His skin was pale and clammy, his pulse was rapid and weak, and he was becoming increasingly disoriented. Maria knew she needed to stop and treat him properly, but stopping meant risking capture for the entire team. Morrison needs medical attention, she told Rodriguez during their next brief halt. Rodriguez checked Morrison's condition and nodded grimly. How long can he continue? Maria examined Morrison's wound and vital signs. The bullet had done more damage than her initial assessment had revealed, probably nicking an artery that was now bleeding internally. Morrison needed surgical intervention, not field medicine. 20 minutes, maybe 30 if he's lucky. Time at target. Garcia consulted his GPS 2 hours at current pace, assuming we don't run into any obstacles. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Morrison couldn't maintain the current pace for 2 hours, which meant Maria would soon have 2 unconscious patients to evacuate across hostile terrain. The mission was rapidly becoming impossible. Rodriguez made the decision Maria had been dreading. We need to call for emergency extraction. Emergency extraction meant a helicopter would attempt to land in an unsecured area under enemy fire. It was dangerous for everyone involved, with a high probability of losing aircraft and crew along with the ground team. But the alternative was watching Morrison bleed to death in the mountains while Taliban forces closed in on their position. Garcia was already on the radio, coordinating with the extraction helicopter and providing their current coordinates. The response was immediate but not encouraging. The helicopter could attempt pickup, but not for another 90 minutes. They were dealing with mechanical issues from their earlier encounter with enemy fire, and the crew chief needed time to complete emergency repairs. 90 minutes, Rodriguez announced. Can Morrison last that long? Maria checked Morrison's pulse again. It was getting weaker, and his level of consciousness was declining. I don't think so. He needs a blood transfusion and surgical repair of his artery. I can slow the bleeding, but I can't stop it completely. What about Williams? Williams was showing signs of improvement, stirring occasionally and responding to verbal commands. His concussion was severe, but not life-threatening, and he would probably regain consciousness within the next hour if Maria could keep him stable. Williams will be okay if we can protect his airway and prevent further head trauma. Rodriguez studied their tactical situation. The ridge line they had been heading toward was still over an hour away, too far to reach before Morrison's condition became critical. Their current position offered minimal cover and no defensive advantages. The Taliban search parties were methodically working through the valley, and discovery was probably inevitable within the next 30 to 40 minutes. Options. Rodriguez asked his team. Garcia was monitoring enemy radio traffic through his language specialist training. They're coordinating a sweep pattern that will bring them through this area in about 20 minutes. After that, concealment becomes impossible. Petty Officer Johnson, the team's explosive ordnance specialist, pointed toward a cluster of buildings about 800 meters to their east. There's what looks like an abandoned village over there. Stone construction, multiple buildings. We could establish a defensive position and hold until extraction. Rodriguez considered this option. A defensive position would allow Maria to properly treat Morrison and Williams, but it would also mean a sustained firefight against superior numbers. The Taliban forces would eventually overwhelm them, but 90 minutes was achievable if they chose their defensive positions carefully. Santos, can you keep Morrison alive for 90 minutes if we give you a secure treatment area? Maria looked at Morrison, who was now barely conscious and showing obvious signs of severe blood loss. With proper equipment and a stable environment, she could definitely keep him alive for 90 minutes. The question was whether the team could provide that environment while under attack. If I can stop the bleeding and get some fluids into him, yes. But I'll need at least 20 minutes of uninterrupted time to work. You'll have it. Rodriguez made the call that would define the rest of their mission. Instead of continuing toward the extraction point, Team 7 would make their stand in the abandoned village, trading mobility for the ability to provide proper medical care to their wounded. It was a calculated risk that put everyone in greater danger, but offered the best chance of bringing the entire team home alive. The movement to the village required careful coordination. Maria continued dragging Williams while monitoring Morrison, who was now being supported by Garcia and Johnson. Rodriguez and Smith provided security, constantly scanning for enemy movement while guiding the team toward their new defensive position. The village had been abandoned for years, probably since the Soviet occupation in the 1980s. The buildings were constructed of local stone with thick walls that would provide excellent protection against small arms fire. There was a well in the center of the village that might still provide water, and The layout offered multiple defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire. Rodriguez quickly organized their defense. Garcia and Johnson would establish positions covering the main approaches from the south and east. Smith would provide overwatch from the highest building, using his sniper rifle to engage targets at maximum range. Rodriguez would coordinate the defense while providing security for Maria's medical station. Maria chose the largest building for her aid station. The stone walls would protect her patients from gunfire, and there was enough space to properly treat both men. She quickly established a field hospital, using her medical pack and equipment scavenged from the team's individual first aid kits. Morrison was her priority case. She started in 4-line to replace lost fluids and administer medication to stabilize his blood pressure. The wound in his shoulder required surgical intervention that she couldn't provide, but she could pack it with hemostatic gauze to control bleeding and monitor his vital signs to prevent shock. Williams was regaining consciousness, which simplified Maria's job considerably. He was coherent enough to follow simple commands and could maintain his own airway. His head wound had stopped bleeding, and while he still showed signs of concussion, he was no longer in immediate danger. "How am I supposed to feel?" Williams asked groggily. "Like you got hit by a truck," Maria replied, checking his pupils with her medical flashlight. "But you're going to be fine. Where are we?" "Somewhere safe for the moment. Just rest, and let me take care of everything." Morrison was drifting in and out of consciousness, but his vital signs were stabilizing. The 4 fluids and pressure dressing were buying time, though Maria knew he would need surgery within the next few hours to make a full recovery. 90 minutes was achievable, but just barely. The first gunshots echoed through the village 45 minutes into their defensive stand. Garcia had spotted a Taliban patrol approaching from the south, and his precisely aimed shots had eliminated the point man before the enemy could determine Team 7's exact location. But the element of surprise was now gone, and the real battle was about to begin. "Contact south," Garcia called out over the radio. "Multiple fighters, at least 8 that I can see." Rodriguez coordinated the team's response while Maria continued treating her patients. "Smith, can you see them from your position?" "Negative on visual, but I can hear movement to the east as well. Looks like they're trying to surround us." Maria realized that the next 90 minutes would test every skill she had learned, every ounce of courage she possessed, and every prayer she had ever uttered. The battle for the village was about to begin, and she was the only thing standing between her patients and death. The battle for the village began with the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles echoing off stone walls. Maria could hear bullets striking the building where she had established her aid station, the impact sending chips of ancient stone flying across the room. Morrison was unconscious again, his breathing shallow but steady, while Williams sat propped against a wall, still groggy, but alert enough to understand their situation. "How bad is it out there?" Williams asked, his voice stronger than it had been an hour earlier. Maria glanced toward the doorway where Rodriguez had positioned himself to provide security for the medical station. Through the opening, she could see muzzle flashes in the gathering dawn light as the team returned fire against an enemy force that seemed to be growing larger by the minute. "Bad enough," Maria replied, checking Morrison's 4-line. "But Rodriguez says the helicopter will be here soon." She was lying, and Williams probably knew it. The extraction helicopter wasn't due for another 40 minutes, and the intensity of gunfire outside suggested that the Taliban had committed significant forces to overrunning their position. Maria could hear Garcia calling out target locations, his voice calm and professional despite the chaos surrounding them. RPG. Smith's voice crackled over the radio from his overwatch position. Incoming from the east. The rocket-propelled grenade struck the building next to Maria's aid station, the explosion shaking dust from the ceiling and momentarily deafening everyone in the village. When her hearing returned, Maria could hear Rodriguez coordinating defensive fire while Garcia called for immediate medical assistance. Santos. Johnson's hit. Maria's heart sank. Johnson was the team's explosives expert, positioned on the eastern side of the village to prevent enemy forces from flanking their position. If he was wounded, it meant the Taliban had gotten close enough to their perimeter to engage in direct firefight. How bad? Maria called back, reluctant to leave Morrison unattended. Leg wound, bleeding heavily. He needs immediate attention. Maria looked at Morrison, who was stable for the moment, then at Williams, who was becoming more coherent by the minute. She had trained for mass casualty situations, scenarios where multiple patients required immediate attention, and medical resources had to be prioritized based on survivability. The training was about to be tested under the worst possible conditions. Williams, I need you to watch Morrison, she told the wounded SEAL. If his breathing changes or if he becomes restless, call for me immediately. Williams nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Go. I've got him. Maria grabbed her medical kit and sprinted across the village courtyard, keeping low as bullets snapped overhead. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and she could see enemy muzzle flashes from multiple directions. The Taliban had indeed surrounded the village, and Team 7 was now fighting from all sides. She found Johnson behind a low stone wall, clutching his right leg while blood seeped between his fingers. Garcia was providing covering fire while trying to assess Johnson's wound, but the intensity of incoming fire made it difficult to focus on medical treatment. Where are you hit? Maria asked, sliding into position beside Johnson. Thigh, I think. Hurts like hell, and I can't put weight on it. Maria quickly examined the wound. The bullet had struck Johnson's upper thigh, probably missing the femoral artery, but definitely damaging muscle tissue and possibly fracturing the femur. It was a serious wound that required immediate attention, but not immediately life-threatening if she could control the bleeding. I need to get a tourniquet on this, she told Johnson, pulling the device from her medical kit. It's going to hurt, but it'll stop the bleeding. Johnson gritted his teeth as Maria applied the tourniquet above the wound site. The bleeding slowed immediately, though she knew the device could only remain in place for a limited time without causing permanent damage to Johnson's leg. Can you move? She asked. Johnson tested his mobility, wincing with pain. Not quickly and not quietly. Garcia was monitoring enemy movement while maintaining suppressing fire. They're massing for an assault on the eastern wall. Johnson needs to be moved before they overrun this position. Maria realized she was facing another impossible decision. Johnson needed immediate evacuation to a safer location, but moving him would expose all three of them to enemy fire. Morrison and Williams were alone in the aid station, vulnerable if enemy forces breached the perimeter, and the extraction helicopter was still 30 minutes away. I can make it back on my own, Johnson said, reading the situation. Just get me stabilized enough to move. Maria quickly applied a pressure bandage over the tourniquet site and gave Johnson a shot of morphine for pain management. It wasn't ideal treatment, but it would allow him to move under his own power for a short distance. Stay off that leg as much as possible, she instructed. If the bleeding starts again, tighten the tourniquet and call for me immediately. Johnson nodded and began moving toward the aid station, using his rifle as a crutch while Garcia provided covering fire. Maria followed, constantly scanning for additional casualties while trying to monitor all three of her patients simultaneously. The situation in the aid station had deteriorated during her absence. Morrison was showing signs of shock despite the four fluids, his skin pale and clammy, his pulse rapid and weak. Williams was more alert, but complaining of severe headaches and occasional double vision, symptoms that suggested his concussion was more serious than initially diagnosed. "How's he doing?" Maria asked Williams, referring to Morrison. "Breathing got really shallow about 5 minutes ago, and he's been mumbling in his sleep." Maria checked Morrison's vital signs and didn't like what she found. His blood pressure was dropping, and his pulse was becoming irregular. The internal bleeding was worse than she had initially assessed, probably complicated by the stress of their tactical situation. Morrison needed surgical intervention immediately, not in 25 minutes when a helicopter arrived. Johnson collapsed against the far wall, his wounded legs stretched out in front of him while he maintained security watch through a window facing east. Garcia had returned to his defensive position, leaving Maria alone with 3 wounded men in varying stages of medical crisis. The sound of gunfire was intensifying, suggesting that the Taliban assault was building toward a climax. Maria could hear Rodriguez coordinating defensive fires, his voice strained but still professional. Smith's sniper rifle cracked occasionally from his overwatch position, each shot precisely aimed at high-value targets. "Santos." Rodriguez's voice came from outside the aid station. "We've got movement on all sides. They're preparing for a coordinated assault." Maria understood what that meant. The Taliban had studied their defensive positions and were now positioning forces to overwhelm Team 7's perimeter simultaneously. Once the assault began, there would be no opportunity for medical treatment, casualty evacuation, or anything except fighting for survival. "How long until extraction?" she called back. 20 minutes. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Morrison wouldn't survive a sustained firefight in his current condition, and Johnson's mobility was severely limited by his leg wound. Williams was functional, but still suffering from head trauma that could cause him to collapse without warning. Maria made a decision that went against every principle of medical triage she had ever learned. Instead of focusing on the most critically wounded patient, she began preparing all 3 men for immediate movement. If the helicopter could reach them, she would have her patients ready for evacuation. If the perimeter was overrun, at least they would die fighting instead of bleeding out on the floor of an abandoned building. She replaced Morrison's 4-line with a saline lock that would allow fluid administration without the cumbersome 4-bag. She gave Williams additional pain medication to help him function despite his concussion. She checked Johnson's tourniquet and administered antibiotics to prevent infection in his leg wound. "What's the plan?" Williams asked, watching her work. "We're going to hold this position for 20 more minutes. Then we're going home." Williams managed a weak smile. "You make it sound easy." "It is easy. I just have to keep you guys alive for 20 minutes. Everything else is somebody else's problem." The confidence in her voice surprised Maria as much as it seemed to reassure Williams. Somewhere during the chaos of the last 6 hours, she had stopped thinking of herself as just a medic attached to a special operations team. She had become an integral part of Team 7, as responsible for mission success as any of the SEALs fighting around the perimeter. The Taliban assault began with a coordinated barrage of RPG fire that shook the entire village. Maria threw herself over Morrison as debris rained down from the ceiling, protecting her patient while praying that the ancient stone construction would hold against modern weapons. The sound of explosions was followed immediately by the chatter of automatic weapons as enemy fighters advanced toward the perimeter. "Contact north." Garcia's voice was barely audible over the gunfire. "They're in the village." Rodriguez was coordinating defensive fires while Smith engaged targets with his precision rifle. But Maria could hear the distinctive sound of combat moving closer to their position, the sharp crack of bullets striking stone giving way to the duller impacts of rounds hitting wood and fabric. "How much ammunition do we have?" she asked Johnson, who was monitoring their eastern approach. "Enough for about 10 more minutes of sustained fire. After that, it gets interesting." Maria realized that Team 7 was facing the nightmare scenario that every special operations unit trained for, but hoped never to experience. They were outnumbered, outgunned, running low on ammunition, and 20 minutes away from extraction in a situation where 20 seconds could determine life or death. Morrison stirred, opening his eyes and looking around the aid station with confusion. "What's happening?" "You're going to be fine," Maria told him, checking his pulse. "Just rest and let us handle everything." "Rodriguez." "He's right outside, keeping the bad guys away from us." Morrison tried to sit up, military training overriding medical necessity. "I should be helping." Maria gently but firmly pushed it back down. "Your job right now is to let me take care of you. Rodriguez has everything else under control." It was another lie, but a necessary one. Morrison was in no condition to fight, and the team couldn't afford to lose their medic trying to care for a patient who insisted on getting himself shot again. Maria needed Morrison to trust her completely for the next 20 minutes, even if that meant not telling him how desperate their situation had become. The gunfire outside reached a crescendo as the Taliban assault wave struck Team 7's perimeter. Maria could hear Rodriguez shouting commands, Garcia calling out target positions, and Smith's rifle firing as rapidly as he could work the bolt. The battle had reached its critical moment, and the next few minutes would determine whether any of them would live to see the extraction helicopter. The sound that changed everything wasn't the roar of the extraction helicopter or the explosion of enemy rockets. It was silence. For perhaps 3 seconds, the gunfire that had been constant for the last hour simply stopped, as if everyone in the village had simultaneously run out of ammunition or targets. Then, Rodriguez's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "Incoming helicopter. Mark your positions with strobes." Maria felt her heart leap with relief and terror in equal measure. The extraction helicopter was finally arriving, but landing in a hot zone under enemy fire was one of the most dangerous operations in military aviation. The crew would be flying directly into a firefight, trusting Team 7 to provide enough security to allow a safe pickup. "Johnson, can you move to the landing zone?" she asked, helping him to his feet. Johnson tested his wounded leg, wincing with pain, but remaining upright. "I can make it if someone helps me." Williams was already standing, though Maria could see he was fighting dizziness from his concussion. "I've got him," Williams said, moving to support Johnson's uninjured side. Morrison was the problem. His condition had stabilized with the 4 fluids and pressure dressing, but he was in no shape to walk to a helicopter under fire. Maria would have to carry him, just as she had carried Williams across 5,000 meters of mountain terrain. "Can you put me down and come back for me?" Morrison asked, understanding the tactical situation. "Not a chance," Maria replied, already figuring out how to move him safely. "We all go home together, or nobody goes home." The sound of rotor blades was getting louder, but so was the enemy gunfire. The Taliban forces had recognized the sound of an incoming helicopter and were concentrating their fire on a landing zone, trying to prevent the aircraft from touching down long enough to load passengers. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway of the aid station, his face blackened with smoke and his tactical gear torn from flying debris. Helicopters 2 minutes out. Everyone ready to move. Ready, Maria confirmed, though she wasn't sure how they would cover the 50 meters between the aid station and the landing zone while carrying a critically wounded man. Garcia's setting up suppressing fire. Smith's providing overwatch. When that bird touches down, we have maybe 30 seconds before the pilot has to pull power and leave. Everyone needs to be ready to run. Maria looked at Morrison, then at Williams and Johnson, both wounded but mobile. 3 patients, 50 meters of open ground, and 30 seconds to cover the distance while under fire from an unknown number of enemy fighters. The mathematics were daunting. "I need someone to help me with Morrison," she said. "I'll take him," Williams volunteered, despite his obvious disorientation from the concussion. "You can barely stand up yourself." Rodriguez was monitoring radio traffic from the incoming helicopter. "Bird's taking fire on approach. Pilot says he can give us 1 attempt at pickup." 1 attempt. If they missed this helicopter, there wouldn't be another one. The aircraft would return to base, Team 7 would run out of ammunition, and the Taliban would overrun their position. Maria realized that the next 60 seconds would determine whether she succeeded in bringing everyone home alive or failed catastrophically. The helicopter appeared over the village like an angry metal wasp, its rotors whipping dust and debris through the air while door gunners returned fire against enemy positions. The pilot was fighting crosswinds and enemy fire simultaneously, trying to bring his aircraft down in a landing zone barely large enough for the rotor disc. "Move! Move! Move!" Rodriguez shouted, leading the rush toward the helicopter. Maria draped Morrison over her shoulders in a fireman's carry and followed Rodriguez across the village courtyard. The wounded SEAL was heavier than Williams had been, and Maria's strength was already depleted from hours of carrying casualties across difficult terrain. But adrenaline and desperation provided the power her muscles couldn't deliver. Gunfire erupted around them as Taliban fighters attempted to prevent the evacuation. Maria could hear bullets snapping past her head and see dust clouds where rounds struck the ground near her feet. Garcia was providing covering fire from his position near the village wall, his rifle cracking steadily as he engaged target after target. Williams and Johnson were moving together, Williams supporting Johnson's weight while Johnson provided security with his sidearm. Despite their injuries, both men maintained tactical awareness, scanning for threats while moving toward the helicopter as quickly as possible. The aircraft touched down in a cloud of rotor wash and flying debris, its engines screaming under the strain of maintaining hover power in thin mountain air. The crew chief was already at the door, helping Rodriguez and Smith load equipment while scanning for casualties that would need special handling. Maria reached the helicopter with Morrison still unconscious over her shoulders. The crew chief immediately took charge of the transfer, helping her load Morrison onto a stretcher while the door gunners continued firing at enemy positions around the village. "How bad is he?" the crew chief shouted over the noise of engines and gunfire. "Gunshot wound to the shoulder with internal bleeding. He needs surgery immediately," Maria replied, climbing into the helicopter while maintaining her grip on Morrison's medical equipment. Williams and Johnson reached the aircraft just as the pilot announced he was taking fire from multiple directions and needed to depart immediately. The crew chief helped both wounded men into the cabin while Maria secured Morrison's stretcher and checked his vital signs one final time. Rodriguez was the last man aboard, having maintained security for the team until everyone else was safely loaded. As soon as his boots cleared the deck, The pilot pulled power and lifted the helicopter out of the landing zone just as an RPG round exploded where they had been sitting moments before. Maria watched the village fall away beneath them, finally allowing herself to believe that they had actually made it out alive. Morrison was stable, his vital signs improved by the four fluids, and the fact that he was no longer being carried across rough terrain. Williams was alert and responsive, his concussion symptoms manageable now that he could rest in a secure environment. Johnson's leg wound was serious, but not life-threatening, and the tourniquet had prevented any significant blood loss. "How are they doing?" Rodriguez asked, moving to check on his wounded men. "They're going to be fine," Maria replied, and for the first time in hours, she was telling the complete truth. The flight to the forward surgical hospital took 25 minutes, during which Maria monitored all three patients while the helicopter's medical team provided additional support. Morrison required immediate surgery, but was stable enough to survive transport. Williams would need observation for his concussion, but showed no signs of serious brain injury. Johnson would require surgical repair of his leg wound, but would make a full recovery. As the helicopter approached the hospital landing zone, Maria reflected on the events of the last 8 hours. She had volunteered for a routine mission as an untested support medic and found herself carrying wounded warriors across hostile terrain while under fire from professional soldiers. She had treated gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and head trauma using field expedient techniques in conditions that would have challenged experienced trauma surgeons. Most importantly, she had brought everyone home. Not a single member of Team 7 had been left behind or lost to enemy action. The mission had been successful not because of superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but because one Army medic had refused to accept the possibility of failure when lives depended on her. The helicopter touched down at the hospital, and Maria supervised the transfer of her patients to the emergency medical team. Morrison was rushed into surgery, Williams was taken for neurological evaluation, and Johnson was prepared for orthopedic repair of his leg wound. All three men would recover completely and return to active duty. Rodriguez found Maria in the hospital waiting area 3 hours later, after all his men had been stabilized and treated. She was still wearing her torn and blood-stained medical gear, too exhausted to think about changing clothes or eating food. "How are they doing?" she asked. "Morrison's out of surgery and stable. Williams has a mild concussion, but no permanent damage. Johnson's leg is going to be fine once the orthopedic surgeons finish putting it back together." Maria nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion finally beginning to catch up with her. "Good. That's good." Rodriguez sat down beside her, studying the small Army medic who had just completed one of the most remarkable battlefield medical evacuations he had ever witnessed. "You know what you did out there was extraordinary, right?" "I did my job." "No, Santos. You did everyone's job. You carried 2 wounded men 5,000 meters across enemy territory, treated multiple trauma cases under fire, and kept 3 Navy SEALs alive in conditions that would have broken most people." Maria looked at Rodriguez, seeing something in his expression that she had never seen from a SEAL before. It wasn't gratitude, exactly, or professional respect. It was acceptance, complete, unqualified acceptance of her as an equal member of their community. "Does this mean I'm not just a medic anymore?" Rodriguez smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, it was a warm, genuine expression instead of the professional courtesy he usually showed to support personnel. "Maria, you were never just anything. We were just too stupid to realize it." 3 weeks later, Maria received orders transferring her to the 75th Ranger Regiment's medical company, a posting that would put her on special operations teams full-time. The recommendation had come from Lieutenant Commander Morrison, who had written in his after-action report that Staff Sergeant Santos had demonstrated exceptional courage, medical skill, and tactical awareness under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The Navy SEALs of Team 7 had requested that Maria be permanently assigned to support their operations, an unprecedented honor for an Army medic. She had become the first non-Navy medical personnel ever to be accepted as a full team member by a SEAL unit, earning respect that couldn't be taught in schools or acquired through training programs. But Maria's real reward came 6 months later, when Morrison returned to active duty and personally thanked her for saving his life. Williams and Johnson had also made full recoveries and were back to operational status, each carrying with them the knowledge that they owed their lives to a medic who had refused to leave anyone behind. You know, Morrison told her during a chance encounter at Fort Bragg, "We were wrong about you from the beginning." "How so? We thought you were just a medic." "Turns out you're exactly what a medic is supposed to be." Maria smiled, remembering the scared young woman who had volunteered for her first special operations mission just to prove she could handle the pressure. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different life who had existed before she learned what she was truly capable of accomplishing. "Just doing my job," she replied, using the same words she had spoken in the hospital waiting area months earlier. But this time, both Maria and Morrison understood that being just a medic meant being exactly the kind of warrior the special operations community needed most. Someone who fought not to destroy the enemy, but to preserve the lives of those who did the fighting. Someone who measured victory not in targets eliminated or objectives captured, but in bringing everyone home alive. Maria Santos had started her military career as an untested support soldier looking for adventure and purpose. She had found both in the mountains of Afghanistan, along with something far more valuable: the knowledge that heroism wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest or the most skilled. It was about refusing to quit when others depended on you, regardless of the cost to yourself. The SEALs who had once dismissed her as just a medic now called her something else entirely. They called her family.